you meet her on the street, Wendy, writes edgy urban fantasy with a twist of murder, described as intoxicating, lush, magically edgy page-turners. Her Holly Stone mysteries follow a coven of witches who solve murders. Sorry, that's quite unique. Wendy is also a poet and reviewer with a background in literature and Indigenous studies. But I saw from the book you're carrying, we're sticking to edgy urban fantasy with a twist of murder. But not too edgy, right? We're in the library?
I've written 4 books in this series, and they follow the same coven of witches who travel around. I'm also right now writing and workshopping a nonfiction book that's based on my writing process called From Spirit to Page, Writing with Your Muse. And on Sunday I was teaching how to write characters, and I thought, I used this girl as an example, so I thought I would introduce her to you tonight. And she's a local girl. She kind of fits with the theme. It's interesting how this is happening. Dad, what are you doing? Maggie stepped toward her father. John Taylor stood before the fireplace holding her mother's Waterford crystal clock in his hands. A wedding gift, it was the only treasure Shannon owned, and no one touched it. Alleged to be a family heirloom, though Maggie had never seen or heard of this family, it had been carved by Irish artisans and filigreed in real gold. It possessed an unspeakable secret. The steady ticking of its precise hands contrasted with the chaotic crackling of the fire in the great stone hearth. Maggie wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. It was an unusually warm September afternoon in southern British Columbia, and the living room was as hot as hell. Dad, she said slowly, give me the clock. She wondered where Bastien was. He usually stayed until 5 on weekdays so that she or her mother would be home before he left. If her father had found time to light a fire, Bastien had been gone for quite some time. Perhaps he'd left before giving her dad his afternoon meds. That would explain his current state. Come and see the fire through the glass. Look, Mags, the flames are dancing. She was close enough now to see the second hand as it crept past each golden Roman numeral. Close enough to take it. You're too close to the fire, Dad. His hands were pink and shiny like giant baby paws. Let me hold it. Her gaze traveled from the leaden crystal clock in his slick hands to the chiseled stone at his feet. Stone he had lovingly laid in the time before. Dad? She reached for it. Ah! Lurching back, he let go. She flinched at the clink of the kitchen door behind her, and then the crash of crystal on rock crammed her ears as the clock shattered into a pile of rubble at her feet. Beneath the wild pounding of her heart, she could hear it faintly ticking, still barely alive. What have you done? Cried Shannon. Feeling her mother at her back, Maggie imagined her growing huge and filling the doorway, a gaping Medusa, snakes flying madly round her head. She knelt among the shards and stared down, unable to face either of her parents. I'm sorry, she mumbled. How could you, Margaret Mary? You know what that clock means to me. She thought of her father and why he was the way he was. It was an accident. I was dusting. It slipped. Clumsy Egypt, Shannon said, her cloaked Irish accent escaping through her anger. Can't you do anything right? Maggie bent her head to protect her throat from the piercing words. Pushing against one of the shards with her finger, she sliced the skin and watched the blood spill out on the stone in ruby beads of liquid rage. Feeling relief, she pushed and sliced again. Why on earth did you light a fire? It's roasting in here. I didn't. Well, who did? Bastien had to leave early, and we both knew that he wouldn't start a fire and then leave. Bastien left early? He said he'd leave you a note. Didn't you see it? That was a loaded question. Maggie had stayed for gymnastic practice after school instead of coming straight home as instructed. Bastien expected her home early, and she assumed that he would stay late. Maggie glanced at the fire. Her dad likely used the note for tinder. Why did he leave early? Family emergency, had to catch a plane. Speaking of which, your passport just arrived. She waved it in the air. I was considering letting you go on that trip abroad. Well, forget it. That accident just cost you the price of a ticket. Mom, please, that's not fair. The 10-day trip to the UK and Ireland was scheduled for spring break, and all her friends were going. It's for grad, and I've never traveled anywhere. Shannon shook her head. Clean up this mess. I never want to see that bloody thing again. Maggie sucked the blood from her finger, then stood and took her father's moist hand in her own thin, wounded one. Sit down while I sweep this up, Dad. Leading him to his recliner, she eased him onto the worn cushions. It's so beautiful, he said, staring at the flames. Yes, it's beautiful. She would never be free. How could she leave him to go to Europe for 2 weeks anyway? How could she ever leave him alone with her? This chapter is called Peace, the Charms Wound Up. Maggie stepped off the porch just as Father Grace pulled up in his black SUV. Shiny and luxurious with tinted windows, it was the kind of vehicle police used to chase down thugs in the movies, and ironically, local gangsters drove in shootouts. She smiled and waved, then went to meet him. Taking Remy for a walk? Maggie's black Labrador retriever circled the priest, wagging and grinning. Yep, he needs exercise and I need a thesis. My Macbeth essay is due on Monday and I have to get an A. She hoped to get back in her mother's good graces. Any ideas? Can't help you there. Shakespeare's tragedies are too dark for me. He shrugged ingenuously. All that blood and violence, it's not good for the soul. Shoving her slashed hands self-consciously in her jacket pockets, she nodded. Father Grace was the only priest under 30 Maggie had ever met, and that alone made him special. Moreover, he played rugby, worked out at the gym, and took the teens on camping trips over the summer holidays. Since his recent arrival at St. Mary's, women of all ages were congregating at Mass, desperate for a sip of his charm along with their communion wine. I think Macbeth is cool. The play, I mean, not the man. She twisted escaped tendrils from her ponytail. The priest's eyes were bright green, not mossy like her own, and matched the emerald cross he wore on a gold chain around his neck. Why are you here now? Did she? Yes. Your mother called and asked me to sit with John for a while. Maggie was glad that Father Grace had taken on a caregiver role. Her dad seemed as charmed by the priest as the rest of the world. Bastian had to leave early, and I don't think my dad got his afternoon meds. She hung her head, still shamefully aware of her error. He's had them now, of course. Did she tell you what happened? When she glanced up, her breath caught in her throat. Father Grace leaned casually against the truck, wearing a black button-down shirt and blue jeans, with his wavy hair shining like chestnuts. He looked like an actor, except for the white collar. No, even with the white collar. Glancing at his lips, she noticed the shadow of a mustache and grinned nervously. It was too much to imagine kissing him when he stood only a step away. She did. The priest narrowed his eyes. Was it really you who dropped the clock? Maggie shook her head. You know how it is. No, but I'd like to. Maybe one of these days we can go somewhere alone and talk. You can tell me how you feel about this and other things. His voice, suddenly low and breathy, sent a shiver through her belly. The full confession. Was he flirting? He was a priest. Still, priests were just men, weren't they? Sure, why not? I look forward to it, Maggie. It's important to have people in your life you can trust. He sighed as if there had been a time when he had not, and she felt a sudden urge to comfort him. I trust you, Father. Good. Your friend Macbeth trusted the wrong people and ended up with his head on a stick. Guilt. It was a complex thing, especially considering Maggie's personal situation. If a man was not responsible for his actions, was he still guilty of the crime? People must be held accountable. Without accountability, the world would be in a constant state of anarchy. However, sometimes there were complications. Temporary insanity, demonic possession. And what if a man was under a spell? As Maggie hiked the trail to Bunsen Lake, one line from Macbeth resounded in her mind. She uttered it aloud. Peace, the charms wound up. Remy loped to her side and she tossed him a treat. Thrice to thine, and thrice to mine, and thrice again to make up 9. Dancing, she chanced to the right and the left and back again. She savored the freedom of her forest. "That's how the witches wind up their spells," she explained to the lad. "They do it just before they greet Macbeth." Obviously, the witches cast a spell on him, and if a man was under a spell, how could he be considered sane? Maggie reflected on this as Remy bounded toward the off-leash dog beach. It was Friday evening, so only a few folks were still there playing with their dogs. She dumped her books on a picnic bench and tossed his ball into the water. Skidding back, he dropped it at her feet. She threw it again and wiped her slobbery hand on her jeans. Despite her parents, Maggie knew she was fortunate to live in this place. Their home perched between two bodies of water, close enough to walk between, Bunsen Lake and the Pacific Ocean. Sometimes the inlet was rank with decaying sea creatures and slick, fetid mud that could suck down small children in gumboots, while other times the water flowed deep, charged by the invisible force of the tides. Bordered by beaches, boardwalks, and parks that attracted boaters and paddlers, along with salmon-chasing harbor seals and bald eagles. Shadowed by the coast mountains and groves of giant red cedars, their yard was shaded yet brilliant with blossoming rhododendrons, planted by Shannon in one of her garden frenzies years before. Anchored by the log house that John had built for them with his own hands, the Taylor family lived in tenuous tranquility at the end of Hawk's Claw Lane. Their lives were so well constructed that Maggie had told only two people, who absolutely required an explanation at the time, that her father suffered from a severe head injury and required medication and constant monitoring to keep up the facade. She had told no one that she was the cause of the injury. Once uttered, the truth was irrevocable and could unleash forces over which she had no control, forces that could change her life forever. As she watched a float plane climb over the mountains, she thought again of escape. She was a fraud, her life a fake, from which she was desperate to flee, yet she could not. Such was her penance. Like Macbeth, Maggie was trapped in guilt, sunk in so far she could go neither back nor forward.